Harlem in 1935 was not just a neighborhood. It was a sovereign city-state trapped within the ribs of a larger, colder New York, a kingdom of neon and velvet where the air smelled of expensive perfume, cheap gin, and the metallic tang of impending violence. While the rest of the country was suffocating under the weight of the Great Depression, the streets of Harlem Lenox's 7th and St. Nicholas pulsed with a secret, frantic wealth that flowed through a system the white banks couldn't touch. This was the world of the policy game, a multi-million-dollar betting engine known simply as the Numbers, a lottery of the poor, where a penny could turn into $6 and a dream of escaping the kitchen of a white mansion downtown. For the people of Harlem, the Numbers wasn't gambling. It was the only banking system they had, a community chest that funded local grocery stores, paid the rent for widows, and kept the lights on when the electric company came knocking. But wealth of this magnitude, generated in the shadows of the AI ghetto, was an irresistible scent to the predators sitting in the boardrooms of the Bronx and the social clubs of Little Italy. The Italian Mafia, organized under the brutal efficiency of the newly formed commission, looked at Harlem and didn't see a community, they saw a harvest. They saw an unclaimed colony of black wealth that was being defended by a woman they considered a nuisance and a man they considered a thug. The woman was Stephanie St. Clair, Queenie, the formidable, French-speaking monarch of the Harlem Numbers who had successfully fought off the psychopathic Dutch Schultz. And the man was her chosen successor, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was unlike any criminal the Italians had ever encountered. He was a man of cold, surgical logic, a poet who read Machiavelli in his jail cell, and a master of the pavement who understood that in Harlem, power wasn't just about how many guns you had, but about who owned the shadows the guns were fired from. The tension began when Lucky Luciano, the visionary architect of the American Mafia, decided that the era of independent black operations in New York had to end. Luciano, along with his enforcers like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, believed that the logic of the white world, the logic of superior numbers, political protection, and police corruption would eventually force Harlem to its knees. They assumed that because they owned the judges at Tammany Hall and the captains in the 28th Precinct, Bumpy Johnson would eventually realize his position was hopeless. They didn't understand that Bumpy wasn't fighting for a bigger percentage. He was fighting for the sovereignty of a race that had been told it owned nothing. The opening salvos of this war weren't fired with Tommy guns in the middle of the street. They were fired with whispers and subtle economic sabotages. The Mafia began by attempting to buy out the smaller black bankers, offering them protection from the very police the Mafia controlled. But Bumpy moved faster. He visited every independent operator on 135th Street, sitting in the back of smoke-filled barber shops and dimly lit pool halls, speaking with a voice that was so quiet it made men hold their breath. He told them that an Italian bank in the Bronx didn't care if their children had shoes, but a Harlem bank did. He unified the neighborhood not through fear, but through a shared sense of collective survival. This was the fortress of Harlem. Strategy turning every apartment window into a lookout post and every street corner kid into a spy. The Mafia's scouts, men in expensive tailored suits and fedoras who stood out like ink on a white page, soon found that they couldn't walk into a Harlem diner without the conversation stopping. They couldn't park a car on a side street without finding the tires slashed within 10 minutes. Bumpy had created a total information blackout for the invaders, while establishing a panopticon for himself. He knew every time a Genovese soldier, crossed 110th Street, and he knew exactly what they were carrying. The Italians were used to the Wild West style of violence used by Dutch Schultz-Messi, loud and disorganized, but Bumpy offered something different. He offered a ghost war. He understood that the Mafia was a business, and businesses hate unpredictable costs. He decided to make the cost of occupying Harlem higher than the profit they could extract from it. This wasn't a siege of guns. It was a siege of the mind. Bumpy spent his nights playing chess against himself, calculating every possible move the five families could make. He knew that the commission was a fragile alliance held together by greed and mutual suspicion, and he planned to use that against them. He started by letting the Italians think they were winning. He allowed a few of their collectors to operate on the fringes of the neighborhood, only to have them intercepted by ghosts. Men like James, Alaban Black, Delroy who would leave. The collectors alive, but stripped of their money, their weapons, and their dignity. With a simple message, Harlem is a closed shop. The psychological impact was profound. The Mafia hitmen, who were used to being the most feared men in any room, suddenly felt like prey. They began to realize that Bumpy Johnson didn't fear the Mafia because Bumpy Johnson didn't think like a criminal. He thought like a general. He understood that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a bullet. It's the realization that you are being hunted by something you cannot see. As the winter of 1935 approached, the cold air over Harlem felt heavy with the weight of the coming storm. The Italians were preparing a full-scale assault, a wave of violence intended to decapitate Bumpy's organization and take the numbers by force. They believed they could break the neighborhood spirit with a weekend of blood. They didn't know that Bumpy had already prepared his countermove. He had spent the last of his personal savings to buy coal for the families in the tenements, ensuring that even as the war raged, the people of Harlem would be warm. He was the Godfather long before the title was a cinematic cliché, a man who understood that power is a debt you owe to the people who protect you. The stage was set for the most violent confrontation in the history of the New York underworld. A collision between the old world hierarchy of the Mafia and the new world defiance of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson stood on the corner of 126th and Lenox, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance, knowing that the next 7 days would either cement his legend or leave him as just another forgotten name in the obituaries. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing like a small, defiant sun in the darkness, and waited for the first Italian car to cross the line. He wasn't just a man waiting for a fight. He was the personification of a neighborhood that had finally decided it was tired of taking orders. The siege was about to begin, and the five families were about to learn that some fortresses are made of more than just stone. They are made of the collective will of a people who have nothing left to lose. And in the center of that fortress sat Bumpy, the chess master of the streets, ready to sacrifice his pawns to take the king. The world thought Harlem was a ghetto, but Bumpy Johnson was about to prove it was a palace. And he was the only one with the keys to the throne room. This was the beginning of the end of the Mafia's dream of total control, a moment where the lines were drawn in the frost on the windows of the Cotton Club, and the message was written in the silence of the streets: "You are not welcome here." And Bumpy, with his cold eyes and his surgical mind, was the one who was going to make sure they never forgot it. The siege was the fire that would temper the steel of the Harlem underworld, a week of terror that would prove that one man, if he owned the hearts of his people and the shadows of his streets, could make the most powerful men in the world tremble. The chess pieces were in place, the board was set, And as the clock struck midnight on that fateful Tuesday, Bumpy Johnson made the first move. The war for the soul of Harlem had begun. When the first Mafia car, a heavy black Cadillac carrying 4 of Dutch Schultz's most seasoned veterans, crossed 110th Street on that Tuesday morning, they expected to see a neighborhood cowed by the weight of their reputation, but what they found was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical pressure against their eardrums. Every shop window they passed seemed to contain a pair of eyes that vanished the moment they looked, and every street corner was populated by men who suddenly stopped talking as the car rolled by, creating a wake of absolute stillness that followed them like a funeral procession. Bumpy Johnson had not just prepared a defense. He had engineered an environment where the invaders were deprived of the one thing they needed most: certainty. The Mafia operated on the logic of the big show, the loud display of force intended to break the will of the opposition. But Bumpy was playing a game of subtractions, removing their informants, removing their confidence, and finally, removing their lives. The first strike happened at the corner of 132nd and 7th Avenue, not with a spray of bullets, but with the terrifying efficiency of the Harlem Invisible. A Mafia collector named Moretti, a man who had built a career on the broken bones of longshoremen, was pulled into a basement doorway while his bodyguards were distracted by a staged argument between 2 street vendors. By the time the guards turned around, Moretti was gone. Not a sound had been made, and the street vendors had melted into the crowd as if they had never existed. 2 hours later, Moretti was found tied to a chair in the middle of a crowded sidewalk on 125th Street. Completely unharmed but stripped naked, with his mouth taped shut and a sign around his neck that read, "This is a private club." This was the hallmark of Bumpy's psychological genius. He didn't just want to kill the Italians, he wanted to embarrass them, to make their fear of him public and humiliating, stripping away the myth of Mafia invincibility in front of the very people they were trying to rule. Lucky Luciano, watching from his penthouse at the Waldorf Astoria, began to realize that his soldiers were being outplayed by a man who treated the streets of Harlem like a laboratory for human behavior. Bumpy had divided the neighborhood into sectors of silence, where every resident was given a role, from the little girl jumping rope who signaled the arrival of a Bronx vehicle with a specific song, to the elderly men playing checkers who mapped the movement of the beat cops. The Italian hitmen, used to being the hunters, suddenly found themselves trapped in a panopticon where every shadow was a potential threat and every friendly smile from a local was a trap. By Wednesday night, the Mafia's nerves were shredded. They began firing at shadows, accidentally shooting at a stray dog or a pile of trash, their discipline collapsing as the ghost war took its toll. Bumpy sat in the back of his favorite diner, eating a quiet meal of fried chicken and greens, while just blots away, the most powerful criminal organization in America was losing its mind. He understood that the Mafia was a hierarchy built on ego, and he knew that if he could make their mid-level captains feel small, the entire structure would begin to wobble. He targeted their supply lines, but not with violence. He had the Harlem garage mechanics, who were loyal to him, sabotage the Mafia's vehicles with sugar in the gas tanks or cut brake lines, ensuring that when the Italians needed to move fast, they were stuck on the side of the road, vulnerable and exposed to the mockery of the Harlem crowds. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, each one tiny but collectively fatal. The 5 families tried to counter by bringing in outside talent, professional killers from out of state who didn't have the same fear of Bumpy's name. But these men were even more lost in the labyrinth of the brownstones. They didn't know the shortcuts. They didn't know the language of the stoops. And they didn't know that the person shining their shoes was reporting their every word back to Bumpy's headquarters. One such hitman, a cold-blooded shooter from Chicago, was found the next morning asleep in his hotel room, with his own gun disassembled on the nightstand and a note from Bumpy that simply said, "You're in the wrong city." The message was clear. Bumpy could get to them whenever he wanted, and the only reason they were still breathing was because he hadn't decided to stop their hearts yet. This was the transition from a street war to a strategic siege. The Italians began to realize that the Numbers' wealth was being spent faster than they could take it not on luxury. But on the defense of the kingdom, Bumpy was burning through. His capital to buy the one thing money usually can't buy in the underworld: total, fanatical loyalty from an entire population. He was the man who kept the heat on in the winter of '35, the man who made sure the local pharmacies had medicine for the sick, and the man who stood as a wall between the neighborhood and the arrogant predators from the Bronx. As the week progressed, the pressure within the mafia ranks became explosive. Vito Genovese wanted to send in 100 men with machine guns and level a city block to teach them a lesson, but Frank Costello, always the diplomat, argued that such a move would bring the full weight of the federal government down on their heads and destroy the commission. Bumpy had successfully forced a wedge between the mafia's desire for power and their need for survival. He was the master of the impossible situation, a strategist who understood that a smaller force can win if it makes the cost of victory unacceptable to the larger one. By Friday, the reports coming back to the Bronx were a litany of failures. Money stolen, soldiers humiliated, and the population of Harlem increasingly emboldened. The people who used to look at the ground when a mafia car passed were now looking the drivers in the eye and laughing. The power dynamic of New York City had shifted on its axis, and the center of gravity was no longer in the skyscrapers of Midtown, but in the dark, defiant alleys of Upper Manhattan. Bumpy Johnson stood in the center of the storm, as cool and unbothered as a statue, knowing that the final move of his opening gambit was almost complete. He had turned Harlem into a fortress, but he knew that a fortress is only as strong as its ability to eventually strike back. The Italians were waiting for the big blow, the climactic gun battle that would end the war. But Bumpy was preparing something much more permanenter. Humiliation so deep that the mafia would be forced to the negotiating table not as conquerors, but as suitors. He lit another cigarette, the smoke curling around his head like a crown of grey silk, and prepared for the weekend that would turn a gangster into a legend. The Siege of Harlem was about to enter its most brutal phase, and Bumpy was ready to show the 5 families that in his house the only law was his own. He was the architect of their downfall, and he was building it one brick, one shadow, and one broken mafia ego at a time. The world thought they were watching a mob war, but they were actually witnessing the birth of a nation. And Bumpy Johnson was its first king. The shadows of Harlem were no longer just places to hide. They were the infantry of an invisible army, and the order to advance was about to be given. Every streetlight that flickered out, every door that locked from the inside, and every whisper in the darkness was a countdown to the moment the Italians would realize they hadn't just invaded a neighborhood. They had walked into a tomb, and Bumpy was the one who held the shovel. By Saturday morning, the air in Harlem had turned razor-sharp, a freezing fog rolling off the East River and settling into the alleys like a shroud. mirroring the cold entropy that was beginning to consume the Italian Mafia's grand design. The five families had expected a war of attrition, a heavy-handed exchange of fire that would eventually be decided by their superior numbers and deep pockets. But they found themselves instead in a nightmare of asymmetric brilliance where their power was treated as a liability rather than an asset. Bumpy Johnson, the professor of the pavement, had shifted his strategy from public humiliation to a terrifying new phase: surgical elimination. He understood that a massive army is only as good as its communication and its confidence, and he set out to systematically destroy both. In the basement of a nondescript brownstone on 136th Street, lit by the flickering orange glow of a kerosene heater, Bumpy sat with a hand-picked crew of men who existed outside the normal hierarchy of the streets, the monsters who had no families, no addictions, and no fear. Foremost among them was James Alabama Black Delroy, a man whose silence was as absolute as the grave and whose mastery of the blade was legendary in the dark corners of the Deep South. Bumpy didn't give them a speech. He gave them a list of 8 names. These were the linchpins, the mid-level mafia captains and specialized enforcers who were the actual hands and feet of Lucky Luciano's Harlem operation. Bumpy knew that. If he cut the hands, the body would become useless, and if he cut them in a way that defied explanation, the mind would follow. The night of the silent alleys began at 10 p.m. In the Bronx, a high-ranking soldier named Petruccioli was stepping into his car after a meal at a local social club, believing he was safe in his own territory, but he never heard the shadow that detached itself from the brickwork behind him. Alabama Black moved with the fluid, impossible grace of a predator, the glint of steel the only warning before the darkness claimed another soul. Petruccioli was found the next morning with his throat cut so precisely that the medical examiner would later say it looked like a professional autopsy. There was no struggle, no shell casings, no fingerprints, just the absolute absence of a man who had been a titan only minutes before. Simultaneously, across Upper Manhattan, the other names on Bumpy's list began to fall with a rhythmic, mechanical regularity that suggested an army of ghosts was haunting the city. A mafia bookie was taken in a crowded elevator. A shipment protector was removed from a moving truck. A bribed police detective was found slumped over his steering wheel in Central Park, his badge pinned to his chest with a Harlem Poliso slip. The message was no longer just about territory. It was an announcement of a new world order. The Italian Mafia, for the first time in its history, was being organized by the very people they viewed as disorganized. Inside the inner sanctums of the Commission, the tension was reaching a violent crescendo. Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese were no longer arguing about Harlem. They were arguing about their own survival. The Ghost War had created a contagion of paranoia. Mafia soldiers were refusing to go on patrols. Captains were sleeping in their social clubs surrounded by dozens of guards. And the lucrative flow of money from the Harlem Numbers had stopped completely. Bumpy had achieved the impossible. He had made the most powerful men in America afraid of their own shadows. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He knew that the only way to ensure a permanent peace was to show the Italians that he didn't just control the streets, he controlled the logic of power. He initiated a masterstroke of community theater, having the local churches and community leaders organize a peace walk through the very streets where the Mafia had been trying to establish their banks. Thousands of residents, from the youngest children to the oldest grandmothers, walked in silent, dignified ranks past the shuttered mafia storefronts. A sea of black faces that represented a wall of resistance that no amount of bullets could pierce. The mafia hitmen, watching from behind darkened curtains, saw the one thing they couldn't fight, a people who were no longer afraid. Bumpy stood on a balcony overlooking the procession, a silhouette of calm in a city of chaos, knowing that he had won the psychological war before the physical one had even peaked. He had turned the numbers into a revolutionary fund, using the money to build a defensive network that was invisible, decentralized, and unrelenting. When the Mafia attempted one last, desperate push to assassinate Bumpy by sending a team of 12 shooters into the heart of Harlem, they found themselves led by informants who were actually Bumpy's double agents into the basement of a collapsed tenement. Before they could even draw their weapons, the doors were barred from the outside and the lights were cut. What happened in that basement remained a whispered legend for decades, but the result was undeniable. The shooters were released the next morning at the edge of the Bronx, their weapons broken and their spirits shattered, having seen a level of cold, calculated terror that made the traditional violence of the 5 families look like a schoolyard scrap. Bumpy was teaching them that in Harlem, the shadows didn't just hide youth, they worked for the king. By Sunday night, the siege had become a total row. The cost of the war had exceeded millions of dollars in lost revenue and dozens of dead or disgraced soldiers. The commission realized that they weren't fighting a gang. They were fighting a fortress that was self-repairing and infinitely loyal. The arrogance of the white underworld had been its downfall. They had assumed that a ghetto could not produce a general, and Bumpy Johnson had spent the week proving them fatally wrong. As the city clock struck midnight, Bumpy received a call. On a secure line. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a demand. It was a request for a sit-down. The architect of the American Mafia was ready to talk to the godfather of Harlem. Bumpy hung up the phone, adjusted his tie in the mirror, and looked at the map of New York on his wall. He had defended the kingdom, he had protected the people, and he had humbled the giants. But he knew that the most dangerous part of any war is the peace that follows, and he was already calculating the terms of a treaty that would change the face of New York crime forever. The Siege of Harlem was ending, but the legend of Bumpy Johnson was now written in the blood of the men who dared to underestimate him. He stepped out into the cold night air, the silence no longer heavy but triumphant, a king walking through a palace that he had claimed from the jaws of the wolf. The board was clear, the game was his, and as the first light of dawn began to touch the spires of the city, Bumpy Johnson prepared to meet the world as an equal. The shadows had done their work, and now it was time for the light to see who truly owned the crown. The sun rose over Manhattan on Monday morning like a bruised plum, casting long, purple shadows across the neutral ground of the Essex House, where the most dangerous men in the world had agreed to meet to decide the fate of a kingdom. This was the final act of the siege, the moment when the cold logic of Bumpy Johnson's ghost war would be translated into the hard language of a treaty. And the silence of the room was so thick it felt like the air before a lightning strike. Bumpy Johnson arrived not as a criminal underling, but as a sovereign head of state, walking through the lobby with a calm, measured stride that forced the mafia bodyguards to avert their eyes. A man who had spent a week breaking the commissions. Spiridon was now here to collect the debt. Inside the private suite, the smell of expensive Cuban cigars and Italian espresso mingled with the heavy, lingering scent of a war that had almost burned the city to the ground. Lucky Luciano, the visionary chairman of the board, sat at the head of a mahogany table, flanked by Frank Costello and a quiet, brooding Meyer Lansky. Men who understood that power was a mathematical equation of risk and reward, and Bumpy Johnson was the variable they had failed to solve. For 5 minutes, nobody spoke. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant, muffled hum of the city below, a psychological standoff where the weight of the previous weeks dead hung in the room like a physical presence. Luciano was the first to move, sliding a silver lighter across the table toward Bumpy, a gesture of recognition that the era of treating Harlem as a colony was over. The negotiation that followed was a masterclass in the cold calculus of the Underworld. Bumpy didn't ask for permission. He demanded acknowledgement of the reality he had created on the pavement. The terms were absolute. Harlem belonged to Harlem. The 5 families would withdraw their button men and their banks, and Bumpy Johnson would be the sole arbiter of justice and commerce above 110th Street. In exchange, the Italians would receive a fixed percentage of the grosser tribute paid for peace, not for control, and Bumpy would ensure that the streets remained quiet enough for the money to keep flowing. But the most significant part of the treaty was the respect clause, an unwritten understanding that no white gangster would ever again use racial slurs or public humiliation to assert dominance over the black underworld. This was the true victory of the siege. Bumpy had not just protected the money. He had forced the most powerful criminal organization in human history to treat a black man as a peer. As Luciano signed the agreement, he looked at Bumpy and said, "You've made it very expensive to be your enemy." To which Bumpy replied with the quiet finality of a closing coffin lid, "It's even more expensive to be my friend, but at least you get to keep breathing." The siege was over, but the reign of the godfather of Harlem had just attained its divine right. Over the next 3 decades, Bumpy Johnson became the architect of a shadow state, a man who sat at the intersection of the criminal, the political, and the social, using his iron grip on the underworld to fund the very institutions that the white world denied his people. He was the man who kept the heroin out of the schools while the Mafia tried to flood at the gates. He was the man who funded the legal battles of civil rights activists with the profits from the policy banks. And he was the man who could stop a riot with a single phone call or start a war with a single nod. The Italians kept their distance. The police kept their hands out for the weekly envelopes, and the people of Harlem kept their loyalty to the man who had proven that the only way to deal with a bully is to make the bullying unprofitable. But Bumpy knew that every legend has an expiration date, and as the 1960s arrived with their new brand of loud, messy violence and federal surveillance, the professor began to prepare for his final exit. He saw the rise of men like Frank Lucas, men who understood the business but lacked the soul, men who would eventually burn down the very neighborhood Bumpy had spent his life building. On a warm July night in 1968, sitting in a booth at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, the heart that had outmaneuvered the 5 families finally gave out while he was surrounded by the sounds of the war wall. Neighborhood he loved, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of jazz, and the respectful whispers of his people. He died eating fried chicken and talking to friends. The most peaceful end possible for a man who had lived by the sword and mastered the shield. His funeral was a state event, a sea of black suits and white carnations that stretched for miles. A silent tribute to the man who had turned a ghetto into a fortress and a thug into a king. The Italian Mafia didn't send flowers, but they didn't send shooters either. They sent their respect in the form of an absolute withdrawal from Harlem that lasted for 20 years. Bumpy Johnson was gone, but the ghost of the siege remained. A reminder that the shadows of New York have a memory, and those who forget the lesson of 1935 usually end up buried in the foundations of the city they tried to conquer. He was the man who taught the world that power isn't about who has the loudest voice, but about who owns the silence that follows the scream. He was the king of the alleys, the chess master of the brownstones, the only man who could make the commission look north and see a wall of obsidian that they could never climb. The story of Bumpy Johnson is the story of New York itself, a city built on blood, governed by greed, but ultimately defined by the few who were cold enough to see, the bored and brave enough to move the pieces. And as the neon lights of modern Harlem flicker over the renovated luxury apartments that now stand where the old policy banks used to be, the spirit of Bumpy still lingers in the drafty hallways and the quiet side streets, a shadow among shadows. The eternal sentinel of a kingdom that was once won by the sheer, unadulterated weight of a single man's will. He was the godfather, the general, and the ghost, and New York will never see his like again, because the rules he wrote in the blood of his enemies are now the very foundation of the concrete jungle. Sleep well, Bumpy. The crown is finally at rest.